The dying woman grabbed my wrist with surprising strength just as the paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher, pressed a sealed letter into my palm, and whispered the words that would divide my life into everything before that moment and everything after it. Find my daughter, Claire. Don't let her read it alone. Less than an hour later, she was gone, and I was left standing in the bright afternoon sun outside a roadside cafe with a stranger's final secret trembling in my hand. Before I tell you how that letter led me to a woman who had spent half her life believing she was unwanted, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances. Sometimes the smallest promise we make to a stranger becomes the reason two broken lives finally find their way home. My name is Everett Hale, and at 37, I had become very good at avoiding anything that required emotional courage. I restored old houses for a living in a quiet Vermont town called Alder Creek, where people admired my patience with cracked foundations, rotten beams, and windows painted shut by decades of neglect. They often told me I had a gift for seeing what could still be saved. The irony was that I had never learned to use that gift on people, especially myself. 3 years earlier, my younger brother, Nolan, had died in a climbing accident after leaving me 3 unanswered messages. We had argued that morning because I thought he was being reckless, and I had ignored his calls to teach him a lesson. Grief turned those silent messages into a prison. I stopped visiting friends, stopped dating, and built my days around work that kept my hands busy and my heart untouched. On the afternoon I met the dying woman, I had been driving back from an estimate when I saw her car drift across the shoulder and stop beside a field of yellow wildflowers. She had managed to step out before collapsing near the cafe entrance. I ran to her, called for help, and knelt beside her while strangers gathered in a frightened circle. Her name, I later learned, was Margaret Ellison. She was 64, terminally ill, and had apparently left hospice without telling anyone because there was one final thing she needed to do. The envelope she gave me was cream-colored, worn softly at the edges, and addressed to Claire Ellison in careful blue handwriting. On the back, beneath the sealed flap, Margaret had written a telephone number and an address in Bellwether, a lakeside town nearly 2 hours away. The paramedic told me that Margaret had suffered a catastrophic cardiac event and that the chances of survival were almost non-existent. I followed the ambulance to the hospital anyway, hoping she might wake long enough to explain why she had chosen me. She never did. A nurse met me in the daylight-filled waiting room and confirmed Margaret's death shortly before 4 in the afternoon. When I showed her the envelope, she looked through the personal effects Margaret had carried and found a hospice identification card. The staff contacted the facility, and a social worker confirmed that Claire was indeed Margaret's only daughter, but mother and daughter had been estranged for nearly 18 years. Margaret had repeatedly refused to list Claire as an emergency contact, insisting she had no right to disturb her daughter's life. Yet on her final day, weakened and barely able to walk, she had rented a car and started driving toward Bellwether with the letter. She had made it less than halfway. I should have given the envelope to the hospital or mailed it and gone home. Any reasonable person would have done exactly that. Instead, I kept hearing Margaret's final request. Don't let her read it alone. Those words reached into the place where Nolan's unanswered messages still lived. I imagined another person receiving a final communication too late, with no one nearby when the weight of it fell. The next morning, beneath a pale blue sky, I drove to Bellwether. The address led me to a narrow bookstore called the Paper Lantern, squeezed between a bakery and a shop that repaired antique clocks. Through the front window, I saw a woman stacking books on a display table. Claire Ellison was 34, with chestnut hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck and a face that looked composed until you noticed how tired her eyes were. She wore a gray cardigan with the sleeves pushed back and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to expect help. When I stepped inside and asked whether she was Claire, she smiled politely until I said her mother's name. The expression disappeared from her face so completely that it felt as though the room had lost its warmth. Claire did not ask whether Margaret was alive. She seemed to know from the way I held the envelope. She locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and led me to a small reading room at the back of the shop where sunlight spilled across two worn armchairs. I explained everything, including Margaret's request that she not read the letter alone. Claire stared at the envelope without touching it. She told me she had not seen her mother since she was 16 and had not spoken to her in more than a decade. Margaret had left Claire with relatives after Claire's father died, promising to return once she had found stable work and housing. She never came back. Claire had spent years sending letters, leaving messages, and waiting at birthdays and graduations for a woman who remained absent. Eventually, hope became humiliation, and humiliation hardened into anger. She built a life without her mother, opened the bookstore with a small inheritance from her father's sister, and convinced herself she no longer cared. But as the envelope lay between us, her hands shook so badly that she pressed them beneath her knees. When Claire finally broke the seal, she read only the first few lines before the letter slipped from her fingers. She stood abruptly and crossed the room, breathing as though the walls had moved closer. I did not know whether to speak or leave. Then she asked me to read it aloud because she could not make herself continue. Margaret's letter began with an apology that did not ask for forgiveness. She wrote that after Claire's father died, she had fallen into severe depression and become dependent on prescription medication. She had believed Claire would be safer with her aunt, but when Margaret tried to return months later, Claire's aunt told her that Claire was finally stable and that another disappearance would destroy her. Margaret stayed away out of shame, then convinced herself that her absence was an act of protection. Years passed. Every year, she wrote Claire a birthday letter but never sent it. Every year, cowardice disguised itself as sacrifice. The letter admitted that Margaret had watched from a distance. She had attended Claire's college graduation from the far end of the lawn. She had stood across the street on the day the paper lantern opened. She had kept newspaper clippings, photographs from public events, and copies of every book review Claire had written. She knew these acts did not make her a mother. They only proved how much love could exist alongside terrible weakness. The final pages contained the reason Margaret had driven toward Bellwether. She had learned that Claire was struggling to keep the bookstore open after a flood damaged the storage room and ruined much of her inventory. Margaret had sold the small house she inherited from her own parents and placed the proceeds in a trust for Claire. She wrote that the money was not payment for forgiveness and could never repay the years she had stolen. It was simply the last useful thing she could offer. Then came the line that shattered Claire. Margaret confessed that she had wanted to knock on the bookstore door hundreds of times but feared that seeing hatred in Claire's eyes would be more than she could survive. In the final paragraph, she wrote that if Claire ever wondered whether she had been forgotten, the answer was no. She had been loved every day, though not bravely, not properly, and not in the way a daughter deserved. Claire listened with both hands covering her mouth. When I finished, she did not cry immediately. She sat very still, staring into the sunlight as dust moved through it like tiny drifting stars. Then grief seemed to arrive all at once. She folded forward, and a sound escaped her that I had heard only once before, from my mother when we buried Nolan. I moved toward her instinctively but stopped a few feet away, unsure whether my presence would help. Claire reached out without looking, and I took her hand. She held on as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. For nearly an hour, she cried for the mother she had lost that morning and the mother she had lost 18 years earlier. She cried for every birthday spent pretending not to watch the door. She cried because Margaret had loved her and because love had not been enough. When she finally lifted her head, she asked whether her mother had been alone when she died. I told her that Margaret had been surrounded by people trying to help, and that I had stayed beside her until the paramedics arrived. Claire thanked me, but the gratitude in her eyes carried a guilt I recognized immediately. It was the belief that someone else had offered comfort she should have been there to give. I returned to Alder Creek that afternoon, expecting never to see Claire again. 2 days later, she called. The hospice had several boxes of Margaret's belongings, including the unsent birthday letters, and Claire could not face collecting them alone. She asked whether I would go with her. I wanted to say no. I had made the delivery, fulfilled the promise, and already allowed more emotion into my life than I had in years. Yet I heard myself agree. We met outside the hospice on a bright morning. Claire looked exhausted but determined. In Margaret's room, sunlight lay across a neatly made bed, a stack of library books, and a ceramic cup painted with blue birds. The boxes contained photographs, receipts, notebooks, and 17 sealed birthday letters, one for every year after Claire turned 16. There was also a small wooden music box with a broken hinge. Claire recognized it immediately. Her father had given it to her when she was 6, and she had believed it lost. Margaret had carried it through every apartment and treatment center, keeping a fragment of her daughter close even while staying away. Over the next several weeks, Claire and I opened one birthday letter at a time. She decided she could not read them all at once, so I drove to Bellwether every Saturday afternoon. We sat in the bookstore's back room with coffee from the bakery next door while she opened another year of her missing life. Some letters were painfully ordinary, filled with questions about school, friendships, and whether Claire still loved thunderstorms. Others were raw confessions of relapse, recovery, fear, and shame. Margaret had often written that she was 1 month away from becoming worthy enough to return. Then 1 month became another year. Claire's anger did not disappear. Sometimes she tore a letter in half and immediately taped it back together. Sometimes she defended Margaret, then hated herself for defending her. Sometimes she said nothing for an hour. I learned that forgiveness was not a door a person walked through once. It was a road that doubled back, vanished under weeds, and sometimes led straight into the pain you thought you had escaped. Claire learned things about me too. One afternoon, after reading a letter Margaret had written during the year Claire graduated from college, she asked why I always stared at my phone whenever it vibrated. I told her about Nolan's unanswered calls. I expected sympathy, but Claire gave me something more difficult. She told me I had turned one bad decision into a life sentence. She said Nolan's death was an accident, while my refusal to keep living was a choice I was making every day. Her words stung because they were true. I became angry and left the bookstore early. For a week, I ignored her messages, repeating the same pattern that had haunted me since my brother's death. Then a package arrived at my workshop. Inside was Margaret's broken music box and a note from Claire asking whether I could repair it. She wrote that broken things did not need to apologize before being restored. They only needed someone willing to begin. That I repaired the hinge, replaced the rusted mechanism, and returned the music box the following Saturday. When Claire turned the tiny brass key, a fragile melody filled the bookstore. She closed her eyes, and tears slid down her face, but this time she smiled through them. Something changed between us that afternoon. We had begun as two strangers standing beside a dead woman's last words, but grief had slowly made room for trust. Trust became laughter. Laughter became long walks beside the lake during the brightest part of the day. Claire showed me the bench where she used to wait for her mother after school, and I took her to the climbing trail where Nolan and I had spent our last good afternoon together. We did not rescue each other. We simply stopped pretending that pain made us unworthy of companionship. The trust money saved the paper lantern, but Claire used only part of it for repairs. With the rest, she created a small community program called Margaret's Room, offering free counseling sessions and recovery resources for parents struggling with addiction and separation from their children. Some people in town criticized her for naming anything after the mother who abandoned her. Claire answered that redemption did not require rewriting the harm. It required telling the whole truth and choosing to build something kinder from it. She placed Margaret's unsent letters in a locked cabinet in the reading room, not as proof that everything was forgiven, but as evidence that silence could waste entire lifetimes. My own turning point came on the anniversary of Nolan's death. For 3 years, I had spent that day alone. That year, Claire drove to Alder Creek in the morning and sat beside me on the workshop steps. She did not ask me to talk. She simply stayed. After a while, I played Nolan's old messages for the first time. In the first, he apologized for the argument. In the second, he joked that I worried too much. In the third, recorded minutes before he began the climb, he told me he loved me and promised to call when he came down. I had imagined those messages as accusations for years, but they contained no blame. Only love. Claire held my hand while I cried, and in the clear afternoon light, I finally understood what Margaret's letter had been trying to teach both of us. Love could be real and still imperfect. Regret could be heavy and still survivable. The dead did not ask us to build homes inside our guilt. Months later, on the first anniversary of Margaret's death, Claire and I returned to the roadside cafe where she had collapsed. The field beyond it was filled again with yellow wildflowers. Claire carried the original letter, now protected inside a simple frame. She told me she had spent most of her life wishing her mother had chosen one brave day, one day when fear did not win. Then she looked at me and said she no longer wanted to make the same mistake. There was no dramatic proposal, no crowd, and no music except the wind moving through the grass. She simply asked whether I could imagine building a life with her. I told her I already was. Before the ending of this story, I want you to leave a meaningful comment about someone you wish you had forgiven sooner, a truth you finally found the courage to face, or the person who stayed beside you when you could not carry your pain alone. Your words may remind someone in our community that healing does not always begin with an answer. Sometimes it begins with a hand held in silence. Claire and I married the following spring in the bookstore courtyard beneath a canopy of white blossoms, with the ceremony held in full afternoon sunlight. Margaret's repaired music box played on a table beside a photograph of Nolan. The bookstore continued to thrive. Margaret's room helped dozens of families begin difficult conversations, and I reopened parts of myself I had once believed were permanently closed. Claire never called her mother's abandonment acceptable, and I never stopped wishing I had answered Nolan's calls. Healing did not erase what happened. It changed what happened next. The letter that began with a dying woman's regret became the first page of a life neither Claire nor I expected to find. Margaret had asked me not to let her daughter read it alone, but she could never have known that by keeping that promise, I would stop living alone too. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Remember that forgiveness does not always mean restoring the past. Sometimes it means refusing to let the past destroy the future. And sometimes, when we sit beside another person in their deepest sorrow, love quietly sits down beside us.